Now that we have some flight paths simulated for these mechanical bugs and instances applied on those particles, let's go ahead and make some particulate trails coming off of these little bug creatures. So we're going to start by using the points from our simulation as a source for a new particle trail sim. Now, the particles that we cached out have a lot of extra attributes coming from the particle sim, and we could do some more cleanup on these attributes before we cache them out to disk. Especially when you have simulations with lots of particles, it can be a good idea to clean up the stuff that you don't really need so that you're not storing tons of extra data to your caches and making them heavier than they need to be. But for the 5 particles for these bugs, it doesn't really matter that much. But when we're using these particles as a source for a new particle system, some of these attribute values might affect the new particle simulation in ways that we don't intend. So it's good to clean up any unnecessary attributes before using it as a source for a new sim. So you could use an attribute delete SOP, but I personally like using the attribute rename SOP to clean up attributes. So I'll just call this adder cleanup, and we'll connect this to our flyer path cache here. And the reason I like using this attribute rename is because this has this option to keep specific attributes. And the only information I really care about keeping from the original simulation is the velocity attribute. So under the points tab for keep attributes, instead of a star to keep everything, let's put in V to keep velocity. So that's the only point attribute that's left. And we can also get rid of these detail attributes. So on the detail tab, I'll get rid of the star there. And we can also get rid of this unnecessary point group. So I'll just drop in a group delete SOP. And I'll put a star in here because we don't need any existing groups on there. And now we have some clean particles to use for our trail simulation source. And for this one, we could just source from these individual points, or if you want to, you could add in a tiny little sphere here to source the particles from. So let's put in a sphere and copy that sphere onto these 5 points. So do copy to points, the points in the right input, sphere in the left, and now we have these spheres on top of those particles there. Let's bring back the instances as a template view for reference. Okay, so right now this is not lining up because we have a time offset on these creatures here. So let's actually just template view this before the time offset for now. And ultimately, we're just going to make a reference copy of this time offset and put that after our trail simulation as well, so that the time offset on the instances matches with the trail sim, but we can do that a little bit later. And now you can see we have these spheres at the center points of these little mechanical bugs here. Maybe we should shrink these a bit though, because we don't want particles emitting outside of these geometries. So I'll scale this sphere down a bit before copying it to points. So now it's kind of sitting inside these bugs here like that. And that should work reasonably well for a particle source. And now let's create a DOPNet for this simulation. So after the copy to points, put in a DOPNet here, connect that to the first input, and I'll call this sim particle trails. And then inside here, we're going to add our pop solver and a pop object. Connect that to the pop solver to the output, and we'll connect a source to the pop solver, pop source here. Connect that to the third input of the pop solver. And because we're using a sphere as input for this particle trail, we can, instead of sourcing all the points like we did for the mechanical bug flight paths, we can do the scatter onto surfaces and use the first context geometry as the source here. We're going to use a constant emission, so we can just turn off the impulse activation entirely. And I'm going to use a very dense emission of particles because I really want to have like a solid stream trailing behind them. And we can use a lower birth rate for the moment and then increase this later. So I'll just start with maybe 10,000 particles, which sounds like a lot, but it's not necessarily a large number for a particle sim. And let's see what this looks like so far. Let's zoom out a little bit and play through this initial setup. So these particles are looking pretty chunky and fat because I have the particle point display set pretty high in my display preferences here. And hopefully this won't be too hard for you to see in the capture if I make these a bit smaller. So I'll turn my point size down a bit to something a bit more normal. Okay, so now we're getting some interesting particle trails coming off of these creatures here, but you can see their particle trails are not really being left behind very nicely. They're kind of getting flung in the direction of these creature paths, which for some cases could be pretty cool, but I really want these particle trails to just really be left behind these bugs with only a little bit of velocity influence from them. So let's stop the sim and rewind that, and back inside our DOPNet for the trails here. Let's go to the pop source, and we can adjust the velocity inheritance here. So under the attributes, we can turn down the inherit velocity a bit so that we're still getting some velocity from the bugs, but not nearly as much. And we can also turn on some variance here. So I'll say add to inherited velocity. And I often like to copy the variance x parameter and paste a relative reference to that into y and z so that we only need to change one of them. I'll try a variance of 4, and we can see what that looks like. Okay, cool. Now we're seeing these particles being left behind in trails in a much more interesting way, but they're just living forever, and we kind of want these particles to die off pretty quickly. We don't want these clouds that just linger for so long. So if we go back to the birth tab on the pop source, we can turn down the life expectancy here. So I'll try something like 1.5, and this is in seconds, so that should be, it's like 24 plus 12, that should be about 36 frames that these will live for. And it's also nice to add some life variance as well, so that you don't see all the particles popping off at about the same time. So for this one, I'm going to use a variance that's almost as large as the life expectancy. So I'll set that to 1, which means some particles will die in half a second, some will die in maybe 2.5 seconds, and we should get a little bit more of a natural fade off of these particles that way. Now, we're also going to jitter the birth time, and right now the stepping is not very obvious. We saw it a bit more severely before we added some variance to the sim. So if we take the variance off of our velocity inheritance and rewind and play through this, yeah, in some places, particularly where the bugs are moving faster, you can see this stepping and the particle emission, because when these particles are emitted on every frame, that bug has moved quite a bit between those frames. So in many different types of effects, when you see these sort of stepped results, that's one of the most common issues with effect sims that are always something you'll need to do something to address. This is generally never acceptable. So a quick fix for this is to jitter the birth time, and you can jitter the birth time positive or a negative, and I'm going to go with a negative jitter birth time so that some of these particles are birthed sort of behind the current frame. And we can interpolate the source position between frames, and I'll do a backwards interpolation. So now if we rewind this sim and scroll through this once again, you can see we have these really nice seamless trails. You don't really see any frame-to-frame stepping anymore. and this is starting to look pretty cool. And these are looking like very fine little snakes right now, and that's because we removed the variance on the velocity inheritance on this attribute tab. So let's bring that back. And this amount of variance did look like it was creating a pretty big cloud of particles, and that's perhaps a little bit more of a enlarged cloud than I really want behind them. But when we add the pop wind, we'll also get some dampening effects of the air resistance. So let's wait until after the pop wind is added before we decide if we want to tweak the variance some more. So let's drop in this pop wind. And for this, we can go with some more small details in this turbulence that's being applied than we had with the overall flight paths, which we kind of wanted to be a bit larger in terms of those turbulence shapes. So I'm going to try a swirl size of 15, and we'll go with 2 levels of turbulence detail here. And for the amplitude, let's just try something like close to 10, see what that looks like, and rewind the sim and play through that. And this is looking pretty good. So now we have these interesting noisy trails. This kind of looks like it could be the basis of sort of an interesting magical effect as well. Of course, we'll have to play around with the colors and such to make this a bit more interesting. And it looks like the particles get a little bit sparse as well. So we're emitting 10,000 particles per second, and we could increase that a bit to get more extensive coverage and these particle trails. You can use something like a pop replicate after the sim to add additional particles, or you can just really crank it up in the pop source. It's up to you. These particle sims, especially when we're not using very slow collisions and such, these are so fast to simulate that there's nothing wrong with really cranking up your particle count quite a bit here. So I'm going to try increasing the particle count to 1,000,000 particles per second and see what that looks like. And the sim is slowing down quite a bit, but that's still pretty fast. And now we're getting these really nice solid trails that are looking pretty cool. And we're going to have to do some more work with color attributes and some rendering tweaks on this to really get them to look nice, because particle sims are very dependent on how they're rendered to really determine the final look for these. But yeah, simulation-wise, this is looking pretty good. And there's one last thing we can do that would make these look a little bit more realistic and like they actually are happening in an atmospheric space. And that's because these particle trails are currently, they're receiving some turbulent noise, but this is an outdoor scene and they're flying up in the air, and there's always going to be some amount of wind drift in a situation like that. So adding some sort of general wind direction can be quite nice. So you could add it in the pop wind if you want, or you could also add that, in this case, with a gravity instead. And as we're working on multiple elements in this scene, we will want all of the elements to have the same wind direction. So when we do the explosion smoke, or maybe the dust from the destruction, or the disintegration of a creature later, we'll want those all to flow with the same wind force. So it can be very helpful to go back to the object level of the scene and just create a control for some of these global parameters. So I'm going to create a null, and I like to give this a more interesting shape. Let's open up our Shapes tab. And my UI scaling, this is really tiny. I'll grab this little spherical guy there for this new control null, and I'll just call this control. And then I'm going to get rid of all the other parameters on here. So go to Edit Parameter Interface on that control null. And for the transform, let's set that to invisible. Set render to invisible as well. Same thing for all these other folders. You don't really need any of this stuff to be visible on that control null. So now let's add a float vector 3 for the wind direction. So I'll call this wind dir, and for the nice label, call that wind direction, and accept that. Now we have this nice clean control null, and you can set this to whatever direction and speed you want. And you don't necessarily have to worry too much about the amplitude of this wind direction just yet, because it might respond a little bit differently in a pyrosim versus a particle sim, so you'll probably need to add some extra multipliers on this wind direction to increase that amplitude or decrease it for each individual sim. See whatever looks right. But now that we've got this wind direction added, let's copy that parameter and go back inside our particles, mechanical bugs section, and inside the particle trails here. And I don't really want to interfere with the behavior of the pop wind right now. So instead of adding the wind force there, I'm actually going to do it with the gravity. So let's paste the relative reference into this gravity SOP here. And this relative reference path is a little bit messy. It's, relative to this current gravity DOP location within our overall scene hierarchy. If you want to, you can clean this up a little bit. This works fine if you click on the force. You can see it's picking up those parameters okay. But I like to just keep these paths a little bit cleaner. So I'll change that to object instead of, a few levels of ... And I'll do that all three just because I'm a little bit obsessive like that. Just keeping it all nice and clean. So we have this gravity being inherited by these particles, and we can see what this looks like. And we're getting a little bit of gravity drift, but we might want to tweak that a little bit, like I said, since all of these different sims might respond a little bit differently in terms of how apparent that gravity force is, depending on the type of simulation and how it's applied. And right now, this wind force is looking a little bit too subtle. So on this gravity DOP here, let's add an extra parameter for this multiplier. You could type in a multiplier on each channel, but it's nice to add a parameter for that so that we don't need to edit each individual part of that vector. So I'll just drag in a float just to the top of this parameter list here. I'll call that gravity mult. And for the label, gravity multiplier, and accept that. And let's try multiplying this gravity amount by 10. And we'll copy this relative reference, copy the parameter, and then click on one of the force vector positions here. So then we'll paste in a relative reference. So we have gravity mult and the reference to the wind direction, and we'll just multiply those together. I'll copy that gravity mult, and then tab to the other components of the force, paste that in there, and now we have a gravity force that's 10 times stronger than what's initially specified on that control null at the object level. And you can see in the bottom of our timeline that we only have a small portion of the simulation stored in memory because we're emitting a lot of particles now. And I have a 64 gig RAM machine here, so I have a little bit more room to store some more of this simulation in memory so that we have more room to rewind and etc. and review the sim with a larger chunk stored in memory. So if we shrink our parameter view a bit, let's exit out of our DOPNet here. And then on the cache tab, this will determine how much of the sim is stored in memory while we are working on it. And you have to be a bit careful because you can really bog down your scene if you expand this too much. But right now, we're using 5,000 megabytes of cache memory for that sim. I'll try tripling that to 1,500, or 15,000 I should say. And then if we rewind the sim to see what that looks like with more gravity applied, let's also, while we're at it, solid template display the bugs themselves. And let's see what this looks like with the increased gravity. And with a birth rate of 1 million particles, this is going a little bit slow, so I'm just going to flipbook that instead. So now if we play this flipbook, you can see we're getting maybe a little bit more gravity drift. It's still fairly subtle, but I'm actually not that worried about it because for this particular sim, I'm just going to render these as pretty tight trails. But of course, if you want more or less of this gravity wind influence, then yeah, tweak that to your liking. So I think this is good enough for us to start doing some rendering on this. So let's cache this out to disk. And on this file cache, I'm going to once again render some extra frames because we want the ability to time offset this. And I mentioned before that we're going to copy a relative reference for the time offset we used on the instances here, because we of course want the trails to perfectly match up with the instanced bugs. So let's right click on that time offset, create a reference copy, and we're going to put this down after our cache. And we have a whole lot more particles right now. By frame 97 here, we have 1.5 million particles. So in this case, we might not want to do too many more frames than we really need. Right now this is a 240 frame shot, and we have a 45 frame offset. So we'll need at least 285 frames of our sim to allow this current offset here. So for a little extra buffer, I'll just cache this up to frame 300. And because we have a whole lot more particles now than we did before, we may want to do some more cleanup on the groups and attributes before we cache this out to limit the data we're writing to those caches. So I'll drop in another group delete, and this will get rid of this stream pop source that the DOPNet has added. So I'll just put a star in there to get rid of that. And I'll create another attribute rename. And for the keep attributes, for this one, we might want a few more attributes available than we did for our sourcing. Now we have a lot of attributes we can remove here, but the ones we're really interested in are the velocity, the age, and the life, because we're going to use age and life to drive the color and the rendering of this. And it's always good to save the ID as well, because that can be very helpful for some post-simulation tweaking at times. So for the keep attributes, I'll select V, age, life, and ID, and then get rid of the star here. And as before, we can also get rid of these detail attributes if we want to. Doesn't really matter too much either way. So now we have this nice clean set of particles here that we can cache out. And then after we write this simulation to disk, we'll take another closer look at using the age and life to color these particles and do some more work on the rendering for these trails.